The tin roof was still ticking as it cooled, long after the sun had gone down behind the ridge. Every other house in the county had a porch light on by that hour. This one did not. There was no porch. There was barely a door, just a curved steel shell dropped in the grass, like something that had fallen out of the sky and been left there. A neighbor slowed his wagon on the road that evening, the way people did when they wanted to look without stopping. He counted the windows. 3, maybe 4. He counted the walls. There were none, not really, just one long curve of corrugated metal bent into a half circle, open on both ends like a barrel with the top cut away. He had heard the talk in town, that the new family, the one with the young wife and the small girl, had spent almost everything they had on a piece of surplus steel the army didn't want anymore, that the man had bolted it to a slab in 4 days flat, working alone, refusing help from anyone who offered it, that there was, as far as anyone could tell, exactly one room inside. One room, no hallway, no second door, nowhere a man could point to and say, "That's where the child sleeps. That's where the parents sleep. That's where a family goes when it needs a wall between itself and the world." The neighbor had laughed about it at the feed store that morning, along with 2 other men who'd seen the same thing. Somebody said the family would be sleeping in shifts by August. Somebody else said they'd be gone by the first hard frost, back wherever they'd come from, tin roof and all. But standing there on the road that evening, watching the last light catch the curve of the steel, he noticed something that hadn't come up at the feed store. A patch of ground behind the hut, low and flat, covered over with sod that didn't quite match the grass around it. Too even to be natural, too deliberate to be nothing. He didn't think much of it at the time. Just dirt, he told himself. Just where the man had piled the extra fill from setting the slab. He would think about it a great deal more before the summer was finished, when the heat came in the way it always did on that stretch of prairie, when tin roofs all over the county turned into ovens by 2 in the afternoon, and one family, somehow, did not seem to be suffering the way the rest of them were. What that family had built was never really the hut at all. The hut was just what people could see from the road. If you're watching this from somewhere the summers run brutal and the winters run worse, tell us where you're from in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if that kind of frontier ingenuity matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. Frank Holloway came home from the war with a duffel bag, a discharge paper, and just under $200, most of it owed to somebody before he ever spent a dime of it. Ruth was waiting for him at her sister's place with their daughter, Etta, who had been 8 months old the last time he'd seen her, and was walking on her own by the time he got back. He had promised Ruth land of their own. He had not promised her much else, and she had not asked for much else. But 2 families of adults and a toddler sharing one farmhouse through a second winter was more than pride could stand. Frank found 40 acres of cheap, wind-scraped ground an hour outside of town, the kind no one else wanted because the well was uncertain, and the soil ran thin over rock. He put almost everything he had into the land itself, and had almost nothing left over for what would go on top of it. That was how he ended up at the surplus yard outside of Kearney, standing in front of a stack of Quonset huts the army had no more use for. Curved steel arches, 20 feet wide, meant to be barracks or storage sheds on some airfield most of these soldiers would never see again. The yardman told him straight out that most buyers were using them for machine sheds, not houses. Frank said he didn't have money for a house and a shed both, so it would have to do for both. He bought one for $11, and the cost of hauling it out himself. For 4 days he worked alone on the slab and the bolting, refusing help from a neighbor named Otis Rayburn, who drove out twice to offer a hand and left both times without having been given one. Frank was not being proud for pride's sake. He had watched men in the Pacific get killed by things that seemed small at the time, and he had come home believing that a job done by your own hands was a job you could trust. He wanted to know, in his own body, every bolt that held that roof over his family. By the end of the 4th day, the arch was up, silver and strange against the flat brown horizon, curved like the back of some enormous animal that had lain down in the grass and not gotten up again. Ruth stood in the doorway with Etta on her hip, looking at the single open room inside. No walls, no partition, nothing but one long, unbroken space under curved tin. "Where do we sleep?" she asked him. Not sharp, just tired and honest and wanting an answer. Frank didn't have one yet. But he had noticed something on the walk back from the well that morning. A low rise of ground behind where the hut now stood, shaded most of the day by a stand of scrub oak that shouldn't have survived on land this dry, and he had not stopped thinking about it since. Word travels fast on land where there isn't much else to talk about, and within a week-half, the county seemed to know that the Halloways were living in a metal shed with no bedroom. Otis Rayburn told it at the feed store first, not unkindly, more out of genuine bewilderment than malice. He'd been inside plenty of Quonset huts during his own service and knew exactly what Frank had bought. A single curved shell with no interior framing at all. You could stand in the middle of it and see clear from one rounded end to the other. A man could hang a curtain, he supposed. But a curtain wasn't a wall, and a wall was what a family needed once a child was old enough to understand what privacy meant. The other men at the store had their own theories. One said the family would end up building a lean-to against the outside once the money came in. Another said Frank probably meant to divide the space eventually, boards being what they were, scarce and dear that year after 2 dry seasons had driven lumber prices up across the whole territory. A third, a quieter man everyone called Birdwell, said nothing at all, which people later remembered as strange, given how much he would end up saying about the Halloway place before the year was through. What none of them mentioned, because none of them had seen it yet, was the low mound of turned earth rising behind the hut, tucked into the shade of the scrub oak, covered over with sod that did not quite match the surrounding grass. Ruth noticed the talk reaching her the way talk always does in small places, second-hand and softened, but unmistakable. She did not defend the hut to anyone. She had her own doubts about it, and she was not in the habit of arguing a point she wasn't sure of herself. What she did instead was watch her husband. Frank left the hut most evenings after supper, walking out past the oak with a shovel over his shoulder, and did not come back in until well after dark, his boots caked with a color of dirt that didn't match the topsoil anywhere else on the property. She asked him once what he was digging. He told her he'd tell her when there was something worth telling. It was not the kind of answer that satisfied a woman raising a small child in a house without walls, but Ruth had learned during the war years to live inside answers like that for longer than she liked, and she decided she could manage a little longer now. Etta, for her part, had taken to standing at the edge of the mound in the evenings, watching her father's shovel come up loaded and go back down again, asking the same question every child asks about ground being moved. "What's under there?" Frank never answered her either. Not yet. Not until he was certain the answer was one worth trusting. The first night they slept in the hut as it stood. No bedroom, no partition, just 4 cots arranged in a curved steel room that had been sitting empty on an airfield 8 months earlier. Frank learned exactly how much the doubters at the feed store had gotten right. The day had been warm for the season, nothing unusual, nothing that would have troubled a normal frame house with proper insulation in the walls. But a Quonset hut is not a house. It is a shell of corrugated steel bent into an arch and bolted to a slab, built to be assembled fast and moved fast, never intended to hold a family through a change of season. The metal had spent the whole afternoon absorbing the sun directly onto its surface, and it kept that heat exactly the way a cast iron skillet keeps heat after it's been pulled off the stove. By 9 that evening, the inside of the hut felt warmer than the evening air outside it, which struck Ruth as backward, unnatural. The opposite of what a roof was supposed to do for a family. By midnight, it had not cooled the way the outside air had. The steel gave its heat back slowly, into a room with nowhere for that warmth to go, and Etta woke twice, damp and fretful, unable to settle into the kind of sleep a 2-year-old needs. Frank lay awake, listening to his daughter's breathing and his wife's silence, which was its own kind of statement. He did not need Ruth to tell him the hut alone was not going to be enough. He had suspected as much since the day the yard man in Kearney warned him these things made better sheds than houses. What he had been counting on, what he had spent 4 nights digging toward in the dark behind the scrub oak, was something the tin roof was never meant to provide by itself. Near 2 in the morning, unable to sleep himself, he got up, pulled on his boots, and walked out past the oak to check on the work he'd been doing after dark all that week. The mound of earth sat quiet and undisturbed in the moonlight, sod settling slowly over what he'd carved beneath it. He crouched at the edge of it for a long while, running a hand over the packed dirt the way another man might check a fence line or a well casing, looking for any sign that the recent rain had gotten in and softened what he'd shaped. It hadn't. Not yet. But he could see, even in the dark, one low place near the back corner, where water had clearly pooled and was slow to drain away. He made a note of it in his head, the kind of note a man makes when he already half expects trouble and wants to be ready when it arrives, rather than surprised by it. He went back inside before dawn, back to his family sweating quietly under curved steel, and did not tell Ruth what he'd seen. Not yet. There was still work to finish, and he wanted the finished thing to speak for itself, if it turned out to be able to speak for anything at all. It was the dog that first showed Frank he was digging in the right place, though it would take him another 2 weeks to understand exactly why. The Halloways had brought an old cattle dog named Duke out from Ruth's sister's farm, more out of habit than plan. The kind of dog that had outlived its usefulness for actual herding, but had never stopped acting as though the whole property was his to patrol. In the worst heat of the afternoon, when the sun sat directly over the flat ground, and even the scrub oak's shade seemed to shrink into nothing, Duke did not lie by the hut the way Frank expected. He dragged himself every single day to the same low patch of ground behind the mound Frank had been shaping, and lay flat against the packed dirt there until evening. At first, Frank thought it was only the shade from the oak drawing the dog over, but he watched more closely over several afternoons and noticed the shade moved with the sun, shifting across the yard through the day, while Duke did not move with it. The dog stayed put on that one particular stretch of ground even once the shade had crept well past it, panting through direct sun rather than give up his spot. The milk cow did something similar, standing for long stretches with her flank pressed against the same low rise, though cattle were less particular animals, and Frank was careful not to read too much into a single cow's habits. It was Duke's stubbornness that convinced him something in that ground itself was different from the ground around it, something the animals could feel that he could only guess at with a shovel and his own 2 hands. He mentioned it to Ruth for the first time that week. Not the full plan yet, just the observation. "The dog won't leave that spot," he told her one evening, nodding toward the mound, "even past the shade." Ruth looked at him carefully, the way she did when she suspected he already had a theory he wasn't ready to share in full. "And what do you make of that?" "I think the ground holds something the air doesn't," Frank said. "I think it stays close to the same temperature no matter what the sun's doing up top. I've felt it myself, working down there after dark. Cooler than the night air some evenings, warmer than it some mornings, right before the frost." Ruth glanced toward Etta, asleep now in the heat of the hut, despite everything, and back at the low mound behind it. She did not fully understand yet what her husband intended to do with a patch of ground that kept its temperature steadier than the tin roof over their heads. But she had watched enough of this war to know that when Frank noticed something and did not let it go, it was rarely nothing. "Show me," she said. "Before you finish it, I want to see what you're building before the whole county decides for us what it is." "Show me," she said. "Before you finish it, I want to see what you're building before the whole county decides for us what it is." Frank hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Some part of him had been waiting for her to ask. What Ruth found when Frank finally pulled back the boards covering his work was not the hole she had been picturing. It was a room, roughly cut but honest in its shape, sunk some 7 feet into the rise behind the hut and braced along the walls with timber Frank had salvaged from a collapsed grain bin 2 farms over, paid for with a day's labor rather than cash he didn't have. The ceiling was low enough that Frank had to duck his head, but the space itself ran nearly 12 feet by 10, enough for a bed frame, a chest, and a narrow aisle between them. A short run of steps, cut directly into the earth and reinforced with plank treads, led down from a trap door Frank had built into the floor near the back curve of the hut, hidden for now beneath a length of canvas and an old rug Ruth didn't recognize. Ruth stood at the bottom of those steps for a long moment, saying nothing, running her palm along the timber, bracing the way Frank had run his palm along the dirt outside. The air down there was different in a way she felt before she understood it. Not damp exactly, not yet, but heavy and still, the kind of stillness that comes from being surrounded on every side by something thick enough to hold its own temperature, regardless of what the sky was doing. "It's cool," she said, surprised at how plainly true it was, given the heat still radiating off the tin roof above them. "It'll hold steadier than that," Frank said. "Up top, the tin does whatever the sun tells it to do. Down here, the ground doesn't care what the sun is doing. It only changes slow, over weeks, not hours." It was, in truth, only half finished, and Frank knew it. He had underestimated how long the digging would take working alone after full days spent on fencing and the well, and he had underestimated something else as well, a mistake that revealed itself only 2 nights later, during the first real rain the property had seen since they'd moved onto it. The storm came up fast out of the northwest, the kind of hard, short cloudburst common enough on that stretch of prairie in early summer. More wind and noise than real duration, but enough to send a sheet of water running off the tin roof and across the yard behind the hut before Frank had finished grading the ground properly to carry it away. He heard the change before he saw it, a different sound coming up through the floor of the hut, a low trickling that had no business being audible from below. He lit a lantern and went down the new steps to find nearly 2 inches of standing water pooled across the floor of the room. He had spent weeks digging, seeping in along the low back corner he had already noted with concern once before, in the moonlight, weeks earlier. Ruth came down after him, Etta asleep against her shoulder, and looked at the water spreading slowly across the floor of what was meant to be her daughter's bedroom. Neither of them said anything about the feed store, or Otis Rayburn, or the men who'd been laughing about a family with no walls to sleep behind. They didn't need to. The water on the floor was saying it plainly enough on its own. Frank did not sleep that night, and he did not spend the hours he was awake feeling sorry for himself either. He bailed the standing water out with a bucket while Ruth held the lantern, and by first light he was down on his knees in the mud, studying the low back corner where it had come in, tracing the path the water had taken with his finger the way another man might trace a wound to find where the bleeding started. What he found surprised him. The water had not come in through any weakness in the timber bracing. It had come in along a shallow crack in the packed earth wall itself, no wider than a thumb, running diagonally from a spot just below the surface down toward the corner where it pooled. He might have read that crack as pure bad luck, proof the whole project had been foolish from the start, the kind of failure that would have satisfied every man at the feed store who'd already decided how this story would end. Instead, he studied it the way he'd been taught to study a failed engine or a jammed rifle during the war, not asking whether it had failed, but asking exactly where and why there instead of somewhere else. What he noticed, once he looked carefully, was that the crack ran along the boundary between two different kinds of soil. A darker, looser layer near the surface giving way to the harder packed clay underneath that made up most of the room's walls. Water moving down through the loose surface layer had nowhere to go once it met the denser clay beneath, and it had pooled there instead, along that seam, until the pressure of it found the weakest point and pushed through. It was not the ground itself that had betrayed him. It was that he had not yet given the water anywhere better to go. He spent that whole day, and most of the next, not filling the crack, but regrading the earth above the room entirely, building a shallow slope that carried rainwater away from the mound, rather than letting it settle over it, and packing a wider band of clay along the outside of the timber bracing itself, tamped down hard in layers the way he'd once seen a mason back east build up a wall, one thin course at a time, rather than all at once. He also did something he hadn't considered before the crack appeared. He cut a second short trench along the low side of the mound, angled to carry any water that did get past the surface, grading well clear of the room's back wall, out toward a shallow depression already forming naturally in the yard. From years of rain, nobody had ever bothered directing on purpose. Ruth watched most of this from the trap door above, Etta on her hip, saying little but staying close, the way she did when she wanted her husband to know she hadn't given up on the idea just because it had leaked once. "You're not angry at it," she said at one point, watching him work. "Ground doesn't lie," Frank said without looking up. "It just does what water tells it to do unless somebody gives the water somewhere better to go. That crack wasn't the room failing. It was the room telling me where I hadn't finished yet." He did not know, standing in the mud that morning with clay under his fingernails, that the worst test of that reasoning was still more than a month away, and that it would not come from rain at all. Otis Rayburn came back around the third week of that month, ostensibly to return a borrowed harness strap, though anyone who knew Otis understood he'd have found some excuse to drive out regardless. He was not a cruel man, but he was a curious one, and the talk in town about the Holloway place had only grown stranger since the last time he'd been by. He found Frank out behind the hut, finishing the last of the grading work along the mound, and stood for a while with his hands in his pockets, looking at the low rise of turned earth and the neat slope Frank had cut around it. "Heard you dug yourself a root cellar," Otis said, not unkindly. "Heard some other things, too, harder to credit." Frank didn't answer right away, which Otis took correctly, as an invitation to keep talking. "Man at the store says you're sleeping down there, in the ground, like a badger." Otis said it with something between a laugh and genuine puzzlement, the tone of a man who had seen root cellars his whole life and understood exactly what they were for. And it was not, in his experience, for people to spend their nights in. "We are," Frank said simply. Otis's amusement faded a little at the flatness of the answer. He'd expected Frank to laugh it off or get defensive, and got neither. "You know a root cellar floods," he said instead, more seriously now. "Everyone I've ever dug on this kind of ground floods eventually, first hard rain or the second. You're asking for trouble, Frank, and you've got a wife and a little girl up there with you." It was not an unreasonable thing to say. Otis had dug cellars himself, had lost more than one to standing water over the years, and had every right to expect Frank's would go the same way, especially after word had somehow already reached him, as word does in small counties, about the water that had come in during that first hard rain. Frank walked him around to the low side of the mound and showed him the new grading, the trench angled away from the timber bracing, the way the ground now shed water instead of holding it. He explained what he'd learned about the crack, the seam between the loose surface soil and the packed clay beneath it, in plain terms, the way he might have explained a repair to an engine to another soldier, rather than a lecture to a skeptic. Otis listened, and to his credit, he did not simply dismiss it. He crouched down and ran his own hand along the packed clay the way Frank had, testing it the way a man tests any claim he isn't yet ready to believe. He allowed, grudgingly, that it looked better done than most cellars he'd seen go in on land like this. "Doesn't mean it'll hold," he said finally, standing back up. "Real test hasn't come yet. This has been an easy season so far. Wait till it turns." He said it as a warning, not a taunt, and Frank took it as one. Both men understood, without needing to say so directly, that the real test of the room beneath the mound had nothing to do with a single hard rain in an easy season. It had to do with what came later, once summer settled in fully over that stretch of prairie and turned every tin roof in the county into something closer to a furnace than a home. Neither of them yet knew how soon that turn was coming, or how hard. The heat arrived the way it always did on that part of the plains, gradually at first, and then all at once, a string of ordinary warm days, sliding almost without warning into a stretch that made the whole county go quiet in the middle of the afternoon. By the second week of it, the tin roof of the Holloway hut had become nearly unbearable by early afternoon, holding the sun's heat long after the day itself had started cooling, exactly as it had that very first night months earlier. Only worse now, sustained day after day, without the relief of a passing storm to break it. Frank had expected this. It was, in part, the whole reason the room beneath the mound existed at all. What he had not fully accounted for was how the heat would behave once it had several straight weeks to work into the ground itself, rather than a single afternoon. For the first 10 days, the underground room performed almost exactly as he'd hoped. Etta slept properly through the night for the first time in weeks, and Ruth herself remarked, quietly and without fanfare, that it was the first stretch of real sleep she'd had since they moved onto the property. The steady cool of the packed earth held against the punishing heat above it, giving them each evening what the tin roof alone never could. Then, on the 11th night, the wind changed direction, coming up hard and hot out of the south instead of the usual prevailing northwest, carrying with it air that had crossed 100 miles of baked, dry ground before it ever reached the Holloway place. It was Ruth who noticed it first, waking near midnight to find the underground room warmer than it had been on any previous night. Not dangerously so, not yet, but enough of a change that she lay awake trying to understand it before deciding to wake Frank. By the following evening, the difference was unmistakable. The new wind, sustained and relentless, was doing something the earlier heat hadn't managed. It was warming the exposed ground around the mound itself, the surface soil Frank had graded so carefully to shed rainwater day after day, with no rain at all to cool it back down. And that warmth was slowly working its way down towards the room below, exactly along the seam where the crack had opened up weeks before. Etta began coughing on the third night of the changed wind, a dry, unhappy sound that had nothing to do with illness, and everything to do with air that had grown thick and stale in a room that had, until now, never needed real ventilation to stay livable. Ruth felt the first genuine fear she'd allowed herself, since the water had pooled on the floor that early rainstorm. Watching her daughter struggle for comfortable breath in a room that was supposed to be the safest place on the property. Frank stood at the bottom of the steps that night with a lantern in one hand, running the other along the timber bracing, feeling for heat, feeling for moisture, trying to understand in the space of a few desperate minutes what months of careful digging had not fully prepared him for. Somewhere above him, through the open trapdoor, the tin roof of the hut ticked and groaned in the relentless hot wind. And somewhere beyond that, the whole county lay awake in houses far better built than his, suffering through the same merciless week with no better answer than he had. He had to decide, and decide quickly, whether the room he had built could actually be trusted to see them through a wind that showed no sign of turning back. Frank did not panic, though he allowed himself, standing at the bottom of those steps with Etta coughing softly above him, exactly one moment of real doubt before he made himself think it through the way he'd been trained to think through any failure that mattered. The room itself was not failing. The earth around it was doing precisely what he'd asked it to do, holding its temperature far steadier than the tin roof overhead, refusing to swing wildly the way the air above ground was swinging under that relentless hot southern wind. What the room lacked was not thermal steadiness. It was movement. Days of closed air, warmed slowly from above by ground that had itself absorbed an unusual and sustained heat, had grown stale and heavy in a space that had no way for that air to leave and be replaced. He remembered then something he'd noticed weeks earlier and dismissed as unimportant, a narrow gap where the trapdoor met its frame, letting a faint draft pass through whenever the wind above caught the hut a certain way. He had meant to seal it properly and never gotten around to it. That night, instead of sealing it, he did the opposite. He propped the trapdoor open several inches on a length of scrap timber and cut a second, smaller opening near the base of the steps, angled to let cooler night air work its way down, while the warmer, staler air already trapped below found a path up and out through the gap at the top. It was not an elegant solution, and he would spend the following 2 days making it a better one, fitting a proper vent shaft using stovepipe salvaged from the same collapsed grain bin that had given him his timber, running it up through the mound itself well clear of the hut, so the room could breathe on its own without depending on a propped-open trapdoor to do it. By the second night with the new venting in place, Etta's coughing had stopped, and Ruth reported, cautiously at first, and then with real relief, that the air below felt different, no longer heavy, moving instead the way air is supposed to move through any place meant for people to live and sleep. Otis Rayburn came back a third time, near the end of that brutal stretch, this time without any pretense of returning a borrowed harness strap. He had heard, as everyone eventually heard everything in that county, about the trouble with the wind and the fix Frank had worked out for it, and he wanted to see it for himself rather than take it second-hand from the feed store. He said little when Frank walked him down the steps and showed him the vent shaft, the steady, cool, moving air, the room itself holding firm against a week that had by then driven 2 other families in the county to sleep outside on their own porches, rather than endure their houses after dark. "Doesn't look like much from the road," Otis said finally, looking up at the plain curve of tin overhead, knowing now what sat beneath it. "It was never supposed to," Frank said. Otis didn't laugh this time, and he didn't offer any more warnings either. He only nodded, once, the way a man nods when an argument he'd been fairly certain of has quietly stopped being one worth making. The worst of that heat broke in the final days of the month, the wind swinging back around to its usual northwest quarter, and life on the Holloway place settled into something steadier, though nothing about that stretch of prairie ever settled for very long. What changed in the weeks that followed was not the hut itself. From the road it still looked exactly as it had the day Frank bolted the last plate into place, a plain curved shell of surplus steel with no more architectural ambition than any army barracks it had once been designed to resemble. What changed was the way people spoke about it. Otis Rayburn mentioned the underground room to more than a few men at the feed store, and not as a joke this time. Birdwell, the quiet man who had said nothing back when the talk first started, eventually drove out on his own, and asked Frank plainly enough questions about the grading and the venting that Frank understood he was asking for reasons of his own, not idle curiosity. By the following spring, 2 other families on that stretch of road had dug rooms of their own into rises behind their houses, neither one identical to Frank's, each shaped by whatever ground and timber and time its builder had to work with, but each owing something to the lesson the Halloway place had taught the whole county without ever meaning to teach anyone anything at all. The lesson was not really about tin roofs or root cellars, or even about heat and cold specifically. It was about paying attention to what the ground itself was already doing, quietly, all the time, long before anyone thought to ask it for help. Frank never called it anything grander than the room under the mound. He didn't put a sign on it, or write it up for any newspaper that came asking, once one did. He built a proper set of steps eventually, and a real door at the bottom instead of scrap timber and canvas, and Etta grew up thinking of it simply as her room, the cool one, without ever fully understanding why the other children at school found it strange that her bedroom was underground. Ruth kept, for years afterward, the same rug that had once covered the trap door before there was a proper door to hide it, worn thin in places, moved eventually to the floor beside Etta's bed, once the room no longer needed hiding from anyone. She never explained to Etta exactly why she kept it. Some things a family holds on to because of what they were once asked to conceal, even long after there's nothing left to conceal at all. The hut itself lasted on that property for better than 2 decades before it was finally replaced. But the room beneath it outlasted the hut, patched and repaired and passed down, still cool in the worst of summer, still steady in the hardest part of winter, long after anyone driving past on the road had any reason left to laugh at what they couldn't see. It had never really been about the tin roof at all. It had only ever been what people could see from the road. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.